It happens on a Tuesday afternoon. You get a call. Someone you love is gone. And within seconds, your body knows something has shifted, something that cannot be undone. You don't need to be taught how to grieve. You already know. And that's the strangest part. Because grief isn't something civilization invented. It isn't a modern response to modern loss. What you feel in that moment, that hollow, disorienting weight, is one of the oldest experiences in the history of your species. And what your ancestors did with it might completely change the way you understand death, ritual, and what it means to be human. 30,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now southern Russia, a child died. Archaeologists found the burial site in the 1950s. The child had been placed carefully in the ground, dressed in clothing decorated with thousands of hand-drilled ivory beads, bracelets on the wrists, a carved mammoth tusk placed beside the body. Someone had taken days, maybe weeks, to prepare this. That child's name is lost to time, but the grief of the people who buried them is not. This is the story of what ancient humans actually did when someone died. And it turns out they did far more than you think. For most of human history, scholars assume that early humans treated death the way animals do, with confusion, maybe fear, and then nothing. You move on. The group survives. The individual disappears. That assumption is wrong. The archaeological record tells a different story. A story of flowers placed on graves, of bodies painted with red ochre, of people buried facing east toward the rising sun, of the living sitting with the dead for days before letting them go. Anthropologist Paul Pettitt at Durham University has spent decades studying prehistoric burial practices. His conclusion is striking. Deliberate, ritualized burial appears in the human record at least 120,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The impulse to mark a death, to do something intentional with a body, is not a recent development. It may be one of the defining features of what makes us human at all. But what exactly did they do? The first thing ancient humans did when someone died was stay. Modern death has become something we move away from quickly. The body is taken. The process is handled. The living are gently guided back toward routine. But for most of human history, the dead remained present, sometimes for days. Archaeological evidence from Neanderthal sites in Shanidar Cave in Iraq, studied extensively by Ralph Seletsky in the 1950s and 60s, suggested that the dead were laid to rest with handfuls of wildflowers, grape hyacinth, groundsel, hollyhock. The interpretation has been debated since then, but what isn't debated is that Neanderthals buried their dead deliberately. They chose locations. They positioned bodies. They returned to the same sites. Staying with the dead wasn't morbid. It was the opposite. It was a refusal to let the transition happen too fast. A recognition that the person who had just left had mattered, and that maturing required time. The second thing ancient humans did was mark the body. Red ochre appears in burial sites across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, stretching back at least 100,000 years. It's a pigment, iron oxide ground into a fine powder, and ancient humans used it to cover the bodies of the dead before burial. Nobody knows exactly what it meant. Some researchers believe red represented blood, life force, a hope for continuation. Others think it marked the person as sacred, set apart from the ordinary world. What's clear is that it was intentional. Someone ground that pigment. Someone applied it. Someone made a decision about how this person should look when they entered whatever came next. The body was not just a body. It was still someone, and it deserved to be prepared. The third thing ancient humans did was bury objects with the dead. At Sungir, the site in Russia where that decorated child was found, researchers discovered two children buried head-to-head, surrounded by more than 10,000 ivory beads, dozens of pierced fox teeth, carved animal figures, and spears made from straightened mammoth tusks, a feat that would have required enormous skill and effort to produce. These weren't poor communities with nothing to spare. These were people investing extraordinary resources into a burial, which means they believed, on some level, that those resources would matter beyond death, that the dead would need things. that the journey wasn't over. This belief, that death is a transition rather than an ending, appears in nearly every human culture that has ever existed. Not because they all copied each other, but because the human brain, faced with the disappearance of someone it loved, kept arriving at the same conclusion independently. This cannot simply be nothing. The fourth thing ancient humans did was grieve together. There's strong evidence that prehistoric communities gathered when someone died, not just to bury the body, but to be with each other, to eat together, to tell stories about the person who was gone. Evolutionary anthropologist Barbara King, in her research on grief in animals, argues that the capacity for mourning is not uniquely human, but the rituals humans build around mourning are. We don't just feel the loss. We structure it. We give it shape. We create containers for grief so that it doesn't dissolve the group. Because that was the real danger in a small prehistoric community. Not just the loss of one person, but the loss of cohesion that could follow. Grief, uncontained, can fracture a group. Ritual, shared grief, does the opposite. It pulls people together around the wound. The fire that burned after a death wasn't just for warmth. It was a gathering point, a place to sit with others who also felt the absence, a place where the dead could be spoken about, remembered, kept alive a little longer in the mouths of the living. The fifth thing ancient humans did was find a way to keep the dead present. At a site called Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, one of the oldest known ceremonial structures in the world, dating back roughly 12,000 years. Archaeologists found human skulls that had been carefully carved with grooves and markings and suspended, possibly displayed in the ritual space. This wasn't desecration. Researchers believe these were ancestors, kept present, honored, consulted. In other prehistoric sites, skulls were plastered with clay and given painted eyes, placed in homes, given faces, made to look, again, like the people they had been. It sounds strange from modern distance, but think about what it represents. These communities refused to accept that the relationship ended at death. The dead remained members of the group. They retained a place in the social world of the living. Their absence was acknowledged, but their presence was also, somehow, maintained. That instinct to keep the dead close never went away. It just changed shape. It became photographs on mantles, voicemails you can't bring yourself to delete, the way you still set a place at the table on the first holiday after someone is gone. Your ancestors carved faces into skulls. You hold on to a sweater that still smells like someone. The impulse is the same. Now here is the part that might surprise you most. For a long time, the capacity for grief was considered one of the things that separated humans from other animals, a marker of higher cognition, evidence of self-awareness, of understanding mortality, of something like a soul. But researchers like Barbara King have documented grief behavior in elephants, chimpanzees, dolphins, and crows, animals that stand over their dead, that return to a body for days, that carry deceased infants, that seem, by every observable measure, to be mourning. What this suggests is not that grief is less meaningful, but that it is more ancient than we ever imagined. Your capacity to love something so completely that its loss leave a hole in your nervous system that didn't start with you. It didn't start with your culture or your religion or your language. It started somewhere deep in the evolutionary past, in a part of the brain that formed long before you had words for any of it. The rituals are human. The grief beneath them is something older. And maybe that's what the ivory beads were really saying. Not this child is special. Not this death is sacred. But simply we felt this. We couldn't let it pass without doing something. We needed the world to know that this person existed and that their existence mattered to us. And that mattering, that is not something we were willing to bury quietly. 30,000 years later, you are still doing the same thing. It happens on a Tuesday afternoon. You get a call. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the grief, beneath everything, an ancient part of you already knows exactly what to do. Stay. Mark the moment. Gather the people who also feel the loss. Keep the person present for as long as you possibly can. You didn't learn that from your culture. You inherited it from every human who ever lived before you. And that inheritance is older than civilization itself.